Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. I'm kind of obsessed with chord loops. I like listening to them, I like writing them, and I love thinking about them. Over the last couple years, I've spent a lot of time developing my own theoretical model for exploring the unique ways that chord loops create harmonic interest. But recently, a new study came out that has me second-guessing a lot of what I thought I knew, and I figure if I'm gonna have an existential crisis about it, I might as well do it in public. So in this ongoing series where I refuse to shut up about chord loops, I'm gonna ask a question I was hoping I'd never have to ask. Am I just, completely wrong? This video is sponsored by Nebula. Okay, so before I get started, quick disclaimer. The paper I'm going to be talking about is currently a preprint, which means it hasn't been published in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm friends with some of the authors, I know they do good work, I also personally reviewed the methodology and results and it seemed valid to me, but the academic process does exist for a reason. I believe this is legit or I wouldn't be talking about it, and I fully expect it to be published eventually, but that could take years and I didn't want to wait. Anyway, the point of the study was to look at how people identify the key center in chord loops, which seems like a pretty important question. One of the big problems music theorists run into with loops is that a lot of our ideas about chord progressions were developed with a specific tradition in mind, and that tradition tends to rely on a model of linear harmony. That is, chords that move in a direction and proceed toward a final goal. A linear progression grows and develops, branching out into different harmonic areas before eventually winding its way toward an ultimate conclusion. Most classical music does this, and we can take a linear approach to many jazz songs too, viewing each section as its own linear journey. Linear harmony even shows up in pop and rock. Your Song by Elton John is a great example, although it's too long for me to play here without going to copyright jail. Point is, traditional theory is great at explaining these linear progressions, but in a chord loop, that's not what's happening. The harmony is rotational, and we don't have a great system yet to explain what that means. This leads to the misconception that chord loops are simple or boring because they don't seem to be doing much by the standards of traditional theory. That was honestly one of the big motivations for me to start building my own model. I wanted a better vocabulary for the structures of rotational harmony, one that followed directly from the actual practice of chord loops, rather than trying to retrofit a more linear approach to something it clearly wasn't designed for. I'll talk more about what I came up with later, but first, let's talk about the study. It was conducted by an all-star team of Drs. Nicholas Shea, Chris White, Bryn Hughes, and Dominique Fouvin, and if you want to study how people hear chord loops, you need to start by picking a chord loop for them to hear. They decided to go with this one because it contains 4 of the most common chords in an order that does happen sometimes, but not that often. And that's an important balancing act. If the loop doesn't exist in real songs, then it's not gonna sound stylistically appropriate, but if it's too common, you run the risk of listeners associating it with a specific piece. Something like the axis progression might have been a better representative of typical loop-based harmony, but then you get all the baggage that comes from its familiar inclusion in songs like Don't Stop Believin' or Jack Sparrow, and that makes it harder to tell if the answers you get are about how people hear loops in general, or how they've heard that specific loop get used in the past. Of course, this does raise the question of whether using just one loop was a good idea. In principle, you'd probably get more insight with a bunch of different loops to tease out those biases. But that's also a lot more data to sift through and a harder, longer experiment to conduct. So from a practical perspective, I get why they went with just one carefully chosen option and left the rest of it for a follow-up study. Another advantage of this loop is that it gets used in different ways. In More Than a Feeling, the main riff plays the loop starting on the first chord, whereas in Stitches, it's the same progression, but this time starting on the third chord instead. Made Alive plays it starting on the second chord, and Sooner or Later starts on the fourth, so every rotation has been used, although those last two were not easy examples to find. This implies some level of tonal ambiguity. It's not immediately obvious that everyone hears this loop the same way, which makes it a good way to look for different listening strategies. With a loop picked out, they found a bunch of test subjects, and this is where I'd normally include a caveat about sample size, but here they got over 150 participants, which for a music cognition study is not bad. Higher numbers are always better, but that should be enough to provide some real insight. There is still the problem most psychology research has, that the subjects were all college students, mostly participating in exchange for course credit. That introduces some biases to the dataset, but the biggest impacts in this case are probably that they're disproportionately young and more connected to the world of American popular culture, both of which seem like good things for the questions we're trying to answer. Still, always worth keeping in mind. And one last bias is that all the participants were music students, so these results might not reflect the experience of someone without any sort of musical training. That's because one of the things they wanted to check was whether classical musicians used different strategies than pop musicians, which it turns out they basically didn't, but that still affects the rest of the data too. Just something to be aware of. Anyway, for each participant, they played them the loop a couple times, then played one of the 4 chords again like this, and asked if the last chord sounded like the root. Or, okay, technically they asked them to rate how well the chord fit the preceding context on a scale from 1 to 7, but you'd expect that score to be higher if they're hearing it as the key center, so it's close enough. Not identical, for reasons we'll get into later, but yeah, close enough. They repeated that a bunch of times, playing the loop in different keys, and starting on different chords, collected all the data from that, and did a bunch of cool stats math to figure out what their subjects were actually hearing. But before we get into the results, let's make some predictions. This is science after all, so we should always start with a hypothesis. What are some things we might expect to happen, and how would they show up in the data? Let's start with what I'll call the tonal hypothesis. A lot of Western music is in a major key, and there's some good evidence that we tend to treat that as the default, assuming any new music we hear is major until we find evidence that it's not. As such, one theory might be that listeners are going to look for a way to hear the loop as a major scale progression, and since there's only one major scale that contains all 4 of these chords, we'd expect listeners to give their highest rating to the C chord regardless of where it sits in the rotation. But there's another option, the metric hypothesis. This predicts that listeners will prefer to hear the loop in kilometers. Wait, no. What it actually says is that these aren't just abstract harmonic events. They exist as part of a rhythmic structure, and listeners will naturally attune themselves to that structure, effectively weighting the chords based on the metric positions they show up on. And since in Western music we have some pretty clear ideas about how people handle rhythmic groups of 4 things, this should lead to a very clear emphasis on the first chord, no matter what that chord is. Those are the 2 main predictions the authors made, but let's try adding some of our own. It's extremely dangerous to go looking for new hypotheses in the data of an experiment that's already been run, but I'm a YouTuber, not a scientist, so I'm gonna do it anyway. What's the worst that could happen? Anyway, let's throw in the linear hypothesis. Maybe rotational harmony isn't a thing. Maybe we're still hearing these loops as directional progressions moving toward a final endpoint. In that case, what would we expect to see? Well, probably still an emphasis on the major root, but to try to disentangle that, I'd say we should also expect to see some emphasis on the last chord in the loop. This is, after all, presented to us as the conclusion of the progression, and that conclusion implies the 1 chord. And then there's the rotational hypothesis. This is the one I care most about because it's the one that's based on my model, so let's do a quick crash course on that. Basically, when I'm looking at a chord loop, I care less about what the chords are and more about how they move. For simplicity's sake, I break this up into 2 categories. There's strong motion, where the chord root moves by perfect 4th, 5th, or some kind of step, and then weak motion, which is anything else, but in practice it's mostly moving by thirds. Using these 2 kinds of motion, I can then assign various chord functions depending on how we enter and leave each chord. If it's weak on both sides, that's an island, a little harmonic cul-de-sac that adds flavor without any direction. Strong on both sides is a connector, a conveyor belt that carries you through the loop. Weak in, strong out is a signpost which starts off a chain of strong motion, and strong in, weak out is a destination which ends that chain. These destinations are, to my mind, the most important part. They're the functional equivalent of a resolution or cadence in a more linear progression, so I would assume people are more likely to hear a chord as the root if it's a destination. And since this particular loop only has one destination, I would expect higher scores for the F chord regardless of its position. That's just a small sampling of possible effects. I'd bet we also prefer chords that are held longer or happen more frequently, syncopation could be a factor, and of course melodic cues probably play a role here too. But on those, we're limited by the study design. They wanted to test for a couple specific theories, so they chose a setup that made those variables easy to isolate at the expense of others. We can't learn about the impact of chord length if they're all 2 beats long. This is one of the reasons it's dangerous to add new hypotheses after the fact. The data just wasn't set up to show those differences, whether or not they exist. But just for fun, one last theory, the null hypothesis. Maybe in chord loops we don't really hear a one chord at all. Maybe they're more like a single harmonic location, combining 4 different chords into one key with no particular center. If that's the case, then our prediction is easy. We'd expect to see no variation at all between scores. All 4 chords should be equivalent. So with predictions in hand, let's look at the results and see how we did. I'll start with the null hypothesis because it's the easiest. Do we see no difference between chords? Well, I mean, the range of average scores is pretty small. On a scale of 1 to 7, they run from around 4 to a little under 5, so it does seem like we're hearing all the chords as plausible and comfortable. But there's still some pretty obvious statistically significant differences, so no, I don't think the data supports this hypothesis. I'm not sure it fully disproves it either. For that, we'd need to see what happens when you play chords that aren't in the loop at all. But I think it's safe to say that while all the chords are, to some degree, stable, we're still employing listening strategies that have room for some sort of key center. That sounds like good news for the rest of our theories. So, alright, tonal hypothesis. Do we hear this loop as major? Yeah, pretty clearly. There's an unambiguous bias towards C. There's some caveats to this, which I'll get into later, but at least for this particular set of chords in this order, listeners with musical training are more likely to gravitate toward the major root regardless of its position. Major scale bias is a real thing. I'm shocked. Moving on, the metric hypothesis. Do we have a bias toward the first chord? Again, yeah, even more clearly. In every rotation of the loop, the highest rated chord is whichever one happens to be first. But there is a problem here. Remember when I said the rating system wasn't exactly asking about the one chord? This is why that matters. As the authors note, one unavoidable issue is that, well, it's a loop. If I play through it a couple times, then stop, you probably want it to continue, and the next thing you'd expect to hear is a return to the first chord. Maybe this isn't a first chord bias so much as a next chord bias. You're looking for continuity, and in that particular moment, this is the chord that provides that. If I'd stopped a couple beats later, maybe you'd have a different reaction. So how do we tell which one is right? Well, honestly, given how clear the result is, I suspect they're both factors, but there are some indications that the metric position is at least playing a role. For starters, there's a 2-second pause between the end of the loop and the start of the probe chord, which should break some of that continuity anyway. I'm not convinced this gap is long enough to completely remove that factor, but it's a trade-off. Wait too long and the subject will lose track of the sound of the loop, and then you're just asking them whether the chord sounds nice on its own. Probably more relevant is that they did a second experiment with a slightly different approach. This time, they showed the participants some notation while the loop was playing, and instead of playing a probe chord afterwards, they just asked which one felt the most stable. The response was overwhelmingly just C, but among the non-C answers, there was still a clear bias toward the first chord. Continuity couldn't have been a factor here, so the metric position does seem to be relevant. Still, would be interesting to see a follow-up study where they stopped the loop at different points to really disentangle these two effects. So great, position matters. What does that mean for the linear hypothesis? Do we hear an emphasis on the last chord? Not really. I mean, it does seem like, well, each chord got its highest rating when it was first. For 3 of them, the second highest rating was when it was last, but those differences are much smaller. I can't say for certain without access to the raw data, but just eyeballing the graphs they provided, I'd be shocked if this was statistically significant. Again, grain of salt, the experiment was not set up to test for this, but it seems safe to say that if this effect exists, it's very weak and not worth spending too much time on. So I won't. And finally, we have the rotational hypothesis. This is the big one for me. Was there a bias toward F? not an obvious one. In fact, F had the single lowest score. When the loop starts on C, F averaged below 4, the only chord in the dataset to do that. Here, look at the graph. The F column is virtually indistinguishable from A minor or G. So that's concerning for me, and I'd be lying if I said this hasn't caused me to reevaluate a bit, but I don't think the situation's as bleak for my model as these results imply, for a couple reasons. First, I can take some solace in the second experiment's results, which, as you can see, do show F in a clear, albeit distant, second place. But more importantly, again, I think that's at least partly down to the experimental design. Now, to be clear, from this point onward, nothing I say is a criticism of the study. It'd be ridiculously petty of me to complain that they failed to answer a question they weren't trying to ask. This is just me trying to refine my understanding of a topic I care deeply about, and I think there are some reasons why the loop they chose might get in the way of testing my hypothesis. There's three main issues here, the first of which is the question of bimodal stability. That is, do the two roots fit in each other's keys? Like in the axis progression, we have a major root C and a destination A minor, but in the key of C, A minor is the 6th chord, which is generally considered stable, and in the key of A minor, C is the flat 3, also pretty stable, so no matter which one you hear as the root, both chords are consonant. In other words, the two hearings are complementary, and it's easy to switch back and forth between them. But in the studies loop, our two possible roots are C and F, which are the 5 and 4 in each other's keys respectively, so hearing one as the root automatically makes the other one dissonant. The two hearings are contradictory. Anything that strengthens one weakens the other, and the C chord here is very strong. That's partly thanks to the second issue, which is that the two potential roots are right next to each other. In my experience, if you do have both a major root and a separate destination, they're usually on opposite sides of the loop, typically in the first and third metric positions. This gives them space to breathe, with the other chords providing a buffer as you transition back and forth. We can think of this in terms of departures and arrivals. In the axis progression, we start on C, depart to G, then arrive comfortably on A minor. From there, we depart to F and arrive back at C. This creates a nice, even back and forth dynamic, taking off and landing in a simple repeating pattern with two alternating poles. But in the study loop, the C and F are right next to each other, so we can't do that. This motion can either be an arrival or a departure, but not both. We have to choose, and since C comes first, it winds up eclipsing the F that follows. This might explain why F did particularly poorly when C was in the first metric position. As for the third issue, this loop is pretty much the best case scenario for major scale bias, right? Like, not only does it have all three primary triads, it has them in the ideal functional order, with 5 going to 1 and 1 going to 4. More precisely, the three major triads in the loop are arranged in a pattern of falling fifths, which is kind of unusual for a modern chord loop. If you do have these three chords, you're much more likely to see falling fourths, like in the axis progression, or the plagal cascade. In both cases, you have 4-1-5, whereas the study loop has 5-1-4. And you don't tend to see that many 5-1s in loops these days. It used to be more common, but as loops have developed more of their own vocabulary, the classical sounding 5-1 has been mostly replaced with other options like the 4-1 or occasionally flat 7-1. The 5-1 resolution carries a sense of finality to it that interferes with the more even harmonic flow of a typical chord loop. That's not to say it never happens. Again, people do still use this loop, but I feel like it's doing a lot of work to really emphasize the major root, which winds up burying the destination. So while this paper has definitely made me reconsider some things, I'm not ready to put my approach to bed quite yet. So what's the point? Why am I dedicating so much space to a question the study didn't even ask? Well, partly because I'm extremely self-absorbed and mostly care about how this new information affects me personally, but also because one of the main things that surprised me about this study is how unsurprising it is. It's asking some pretty basic questions and finding that the answers are roughly what any theorist who's worked in the space would have guessed. And don't get me wrong, testing those intuitions is important and I'm glad they did, but it's also an indication that this field is still in its infancy. There's so many more questions to ask and so much more research to do. And that's not just me. The authors say the same thing in their conclusion, calling for further tests that look at other orderings of these four chords as well as other popular loops. And that's why I still think we need a better vocabulary for this stuff. Sure, major scale bias is an important factor, but not every loop has a clear associated major scale. Something like the creep loop resists that sort of tonal analysis, but it clearly still works. Why? It makes sense to start with the easy loops, but eventually we're going to need tools that can handle the harder ones too. So I love this study. It's really well done, and it sheds some much needed light on an under-researched area of modern popular music, but I also agree with the authors that this is just the beginning, and I'm excited to see where it goes. I mentioned before that I really don't like the idea that modern music is boring, but I do get where it's coming from. There's so much incredible music happening right now, but it's not always easy to find. The fracturing media landscapes of the 21st century have made a lot more music available, but it takes time and effort to sort through all those options to find the things that really speak to you, and with so many new things coming out every year, it's hard to know where to begin. But if you're stuck in that rut right now, one good starting point is Polyphonic Magazine, which, despite the name, is actually a series of videos. In it, my friend Noah presents in-depth guides to cool, modern, underground musicians in a bunch of different genres, including exclusive interviews about their creative process. The first episode features Backwash, one of the most exciting rappers in the game right now, and if you haven't heard of her, you owe it to yourself to check it out. But the thing is, Polyphonic Magazine couldn't really exist here on YouTube. It's focused on artists that people haven't already heard of, which I can tell you from experience is a recipe for algorithmic disaster. So we built our own platform. Nebula is a streaming service built by a bunch of the online video world's coolest creators, including lots of great music channels like Adam Neely, Amy Nolte, Todd in the Shadows, and Volksgeist, and we made it specifically to give us the space to make cool things like Polyphonic Magazine without having to worry if the algorithm will be nice to them. Nebula has freed up a lot of creators to make a lot of things that really wouldn't thrive elsewhere. I even did a video essay about one of my favorite TV shows, The Prisoner, which absolutely would not fit on 12-tone, but I'm really proud of it. Plus, Nebula produces my podcast, Ghost Notes, which I'm also really proud of, and to say thanks, new episodes of that go up a month early on Nebula. So if you want to check any of that out, you can go to nebula.tv/12tone, or just click the link in the description to get 40% off an annual plan. That comes out to just $2.50 a month, and a portion of that also goes directly to me, so I can keep pretending that drawing cartoon elephants about music theory is a real job. And yeah, thanks for watching. This was a super interesting one for me to make. I was really struck by the study when I read it, because again, if you've watched me for a long time, you know I love talking about chord loops, and so much of what I had seen about chord loops was very theoretical and very much just making up models like I did, if I'm being honest. And that made it really exciting to see some of this stuff actually get tested. Again, I don't think it was asking the exact questions that I personally would have wanted it to be asking, but that's not really a criticism, that's just I want there to be more research. In fact, really none of this should be read as a criticism. My entire point is that this was a really cool thing to do, and I want there to be more of it. So if you're watching this and you happen to be a professor or a grad student and you're looking for some projects to do, maybe look at chord loops. They're cool, and I like them. And I might make a video about the paper you publish. I probably will, if you send it to me. Heck, I might even make a video before you publish, like I did with this one. I will say on that, I wasn't entirely sure what the etiquette was in doing a video about a preprint. That's a weird sort of space to be operating in, so I did reach out to the authors as a precaution and double check that they were cool with it. And yeah, as always, I really want to thank my Patreon patrons. I joke about the idea that this is a real job, but it is a lot of work, and it means a lot to me that anyone watches it, and that some of you watch it enough and care about it enough and think it's valuable enough to be willing to throw some money at me to help me keep making it. That's super cool, and I want to be clear that I do not take that generosity for granted. It's fundamentally transformed my life, and I am deeply grateful for the opportunities you all have given me. I do especially want to thank my featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewart, Damian Fuller Sutherland, John Hancock, Neil Moore, and Jeff, whose continued support really goes a long way toward making this all work. I should say before I sign off, I'm going to put a link to the preprint in the description. It's freely available online, and if you have the technical background, I really do recommend you read it yourself. I tried to summarize it as accurately and fairly as possible, but there's always going to be nuance lost, and especially for a preprint, I do think it's worth making those evaluations yourself and not just trusting what some doofus on YouTube says. I'm not a doofus. I'm an expert. I'm also a doofus. I can be both. Beyond that, typical YouTube stuff. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, as always, keep on rockin'.